This week, a bipartisan amendment to protect web search history failed to pass in the Senate. However, a 2.5-year extension on parts of the FISA process did pass. Also, more controversy surrounds Attorney General William Barr's dropping of the Michael Flynn case. All this will be discussed today on the Tonic Accord podcast. Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining us again on the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm Alex Kapitko, joined with my friend and co-host, Drew. Drew, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Just had my cup of coffee, and I'm ready to talk about some Senate stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's been another interesting week. I feel like not enough people are really talking about this stuff. Clearly there's other things going on in the news, but what are your takeaways from all this stuff right now?
I definitely think that's a big point is, with the obvious situation being an omniscient problem in everyone's lives, this coronavirus pandemic. I think a lot of people either have news, fatigue, right? They're kind of just like, everything's so bad, I'm not going to pay attention. Or they're just focused on other things like the coronavirus. So you're not focused on, Senate bills about national security and intelligence restrictions. Like, this is already something that people don't follow in general anyway. And I think given the current time, it's even more getting brushed under the rug.
Yeah, most definitely. And, I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about maybe like 2 months ago about how during times of crisis, governments sometimes take advantage of it. We saw this with the Patriot Act after 9/11. Right. And I think we're seeing some more, carrying away for that. And for people that aren't aware, there were several votes this week on Wednesday and Thursday. And to me, at least one of the bigger ones that I think is getting covered, we'll touch on the other ones, but was the bipartisan amendment, which was to protect web search history and browsing history. And it failed to pass the 60-vote threshold by one vote. And many Democratic caucus members, including Bernie Sanders, failed to show up. And a lot of people think this could have been one of the reasons. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I've always been kind of a libertarian, I guess, when it comes to intelligence and surveillance. And to me, it kind of seems like exactly what we talked about a couple months ago with governments kind of taking advantage of this time. And it kind of worries me about what they're going to do with this. I just don't feel like every American should be searched without any rights in saying so.
Right. Well, again, it's that warrant process, right? It's like, look, like it's the idea is now that they can use your internet browse search history in investigations without getting a warrant, right? And that and that's the big problem is, look, like, do I think that we need to be looking at the internet history of criminals or terrorists? Yeah, absolutely. But that's through the bureaucratic process to justify it. Which is, a warrant, or, obviously if it's a foreign-born terrorist, you don't need a warrant, right? Just spy on him if he's an Al-Qaeda guy or whatever. But,
right.
But like, yeah, if we're talking about U.S. citizens, we do need to look at the internet history of criminals or of people that might need it via the warrant process. But without a warrant, without that ability to then go to a judge and have to justify what you're doing or your action, right? Because that's what a warrant is for people that don't know. You go to a judge and you say, hey, look, this is what we think is going on. This is what we need to get information on. This is how we're going to do it. You go through all the steps, and then the judge says, okay, this is legal. This is justified. I'll approve this. Or they say, no, you don't have enough here to justify this action. I'm not going to approve it, right? So I think it's necessary to have that accountability process when dealing with, investigating U.S. citizens. So now that they can obtain your internet history and your search history without a warrant, without the need to justify it in the legal system, is really worrying.
Yes, definitely. And unfortunately, it's kind of been this escalating process since 9/11, and I would personally argue that 9/11 pretty much changed the entire just scope of mass surveillance, right? And this is just kind of another step towards that. And to me, it's interesting, I think, like looking at kind of the face of this vote and kind of the division in the Senate in this, because it's not your typical Republican-Democrat split. It's the fight over privacy kind of has two coalitions. You have kind of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. who opposed more surveillance, basically. And then you, on the other side, kind of have just the establishment Republicans and Democrats who are in support of it, which is kind of interesting. Like you have Mitch McConnell and Dianne Feinstein, for example, both supporting it. Then you have obvious people like Rand Paul not supporting it, and I'm guessing Bernie would not have probably supported it either if he had been there.
If he had been there, right? Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that too, right? It's like these establishment wings that maybe more so rely on large, strong federal governments, right? Your Democratic establishment wants a strong federal government. That's no secret. We've been knew that. And then we also now know that there's a strong establishment Republican side of that, that neoconservative, that Dick Cheney wing of the Republican Party that is super heavy military industrial complex, strong federal government, strong intelligence system. They're on the same side of that coin of the Dianne Feinsteins, a strong federal government with a lot of authority and power, maybe for different reasons, but they still want it. And then it is weird that you have these almost horseshoe of a coalition. You go far enough right where you don't trust the government, and then you go far enough left where you really don't trust the government, and then they come back around to this where it's like, hey, I think you guys might need to get a warrant before you look at what I search on my internet all the time. And I'm in that same camp. I'm not even that extreme on either side, but I definitely think that, I definitely think that there needs to be this accountability where the government should justify its actions, especially when taking them against U.S. citizens.
Yeah, completely. And I'm no tinfoil hat wearer by any means. But unfortunately, if you're someone who is hesitant of government intervention and the power of the federal government, especially during a time like this, right, where we see a large kind of breakdown in trust that has escalated with this pandemic, and now you have the government wanting to intervene more and more in something that I do consider should be a privacy right, you're going to have people that think this is unacceptable. And it's just going to, I think, push more and more people to be able to believe that the federal government is a malice that is not looking out for your best interests, And I think, interestingly enough, Trump has touted about every conspiracy in the world involving a lot of these processes. But I think the interesting thing is that through the amount of coverage he's got on this, in some ways, I think he's done a good job about bringing to the light some of the actual issues in this process. I mean, because I want to touch on the other votes that happened, which involved the FISA reform. Because to me, this was the part that wasn't covered as much.
You're right.
But it actually could be more detrimental. Because one of the second privacy-focused amendments was to the Patriot Act, and this was where the Senate approved a 2.5-year extension of parts of the FISA, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, on Thursday. And this was known as the Leahy-Lee Amendment, which was named because of the bipartisan support. And it authorizes national security and foreign intelligence surveillance on U.S. soil and kind of allows them to expedite the process without getting approval from your typical courts that usually would be needed to get a warrant. And that's why I kind of bring up Trump on this, is because, during the whole Russia scandal and all the chaos that unfolded after that, I think there was kind of a magnifying glass put on both sides on this FISA process, involving the Steele dossier, Michael Flynn, Carter, right? Not Ash Carter, the other Carter.
Carter Page.
Carter Page, yeah, there we go, thanks. And I think it's allowed us to see that there are necessary reforms that need to be done, because sometimes they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater with these, and I don't know if that's where I want to see our government go. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of intricacies of the FISA that I'm definitely not super knowledgeable on. I did see that some of these amendments seem like they're actually limiting some of the extensions of the Patriot Act. I'm trying to understand it every part, but it's the one part about the internet history we're talking about was something brought by a Montana Republican and an Oregon Democrat, and then to curb the surveillance of browser history, but that failed. But but it looks like the one from Rand Paul tried to get one passed that would have required traditional courts to approve FISA warrants for U.S. citizens to make it harder to do to do things against U.S. citizens, but that was rejected. There's a lot of different moving parts that I'm trying to get a full grasp on as far as all these votes. Rand Paul has always been a staunch, anti-surveillance, anti-big surveillance government. He's more the libertarian wing, but his amendment looks like that was rejected.
Yes.
Okay. So it says here that this bill originally came after legislation that was passed down from the House in March. The House bill put together a bipartisan deal that allowed an inspector general report Okay, I see. So they made reforms after the FISA warrants were criticized during that whole Russia thing. And then leading to kind of some illegitimacy on some of the information. So I can see how you would want to add these more third-party watchdogs over these FISA warrants. I'm all for that. I'm definitely all for that.
Yeah, kind of what I got out of this, because you're right. There's a lot of moving pieces, and it is confusing. Was from what I saw was back in 2019. I think it was in December. The Department, of Justice and Internal Watchdog, who is Horowitz, found that there were apparent errors and inadequately supported facts involved in the FISA process. And he did find that some of the FBI's handlings when they were investigating Carter Page involved this. And so basically, there's something called, this is from PBS, because I was a little bit curious, and there's something called the Woods procedures. And these are the processes for ensuring that each fact in a FISA application is supported with documentation.
Uh-huh.
And basically what it appears is that in 4 of the 29 cases involved, they did not support the investigations with documentation. So in some ways, it kind of sounds like a rubber stamp process. And I'm not completely saying it because it's only 4 out of 29. But 4 out of 29 is not 0.
4 out of 29 of the FISA cases involved in the Russia investigation, or just in general?
In general, over the last 2 years.
Okay, over the last 2 years, 4 out of 29 FISA warrants have not been backed up factually by documentation.
Yes, and Carter Page was one of those.
And Carter Page, okay, wow. So then, yeah, so that led to a lot of confusion and mudslinging, that's for sure. So yeah, look, if part of this bill is that there needs to be more independent oversight, or at least accountability for these FISA warrants, yeah, I'm all for it. Especially if it can avoid problems like Carter Page in the future, where one aspect of an investigation then threatens the legitimacy of the entire thing, even when there are legitimate concerns in the investigation, right? Back to that thing with the whole Carter Page, right? When that was going on, people were using that to basically then throw out the book and then let's not investigate anything regarding Russia. I don't take it that far, but it definitely shows that there's issues with how our federal government does its investigations, and then there's all these gray areas when it's against citizens, but then citizens acting with foreign governments, right? And that's the whole problem with Flynn right now, is the whole debate over whether or not the FBI correctly handled their investigation of Michael Flynn, and there's a lot of questions about that. And so this Senate vote does kind of tie into some other things, right? With the Department of Justice dropping the Flynn case, because I think a lot of people are asking, how does our federal government go about some of these complicated and gray areas of investigating U.S. citizens?
Yeah, exactly. And I think we should kind of get into the Michael Flynn a little bit, because you're right, it does tie in. And I wanted to kind of leave this part just with what Rand Paul had said, just because I think he's completely accurate. And I agree about half the time with Rand Paul, and about half the time I don't. But usually when it involves government surveillance, I'm with him. But he said that involving one of the votes with the FISA process that occurred, he said it's a false exchange of liberty for a false sense of security. And I think that is just to kind of put a bow on that part. That's my big issue with the failure of that amendment to pass on search history.
Right.
Is that I think the government is trying to sell it to people, or at least the supporters of this enhancement of surveillance, saying that it's a utilitarian goal that we all open ourselves up so that we catch everyone, but it's a slippery slope, and I think the libertarian wing on that is probably correct, because there's not a lot of evidence that really shows that by surveilling everybody, you're much safer than surveilling nobody. And I remember I had a professor in college tell me that when you try to look for terrorism and stop terrorism in every aspect of a democracy, you're no longer a democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
And you also have to think about this too, is if you set up all these massive institutions to find terrorists and you fund them with billions of dollars and you don't find any terrorists, well, then you lose your job. You lose your job. If you're so effective at your government of your protection that there's no terrorism, then you lose your job. So it's one of these weird, like, some of these defense programs kind of have this problem of, like, we need to make sure that this thing is like, we need to find terrorists so that we can continue to find terrorists.
Yeah, it's an interesting chicken or the egg argument there.
Yeah.
We could almost get into.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like private prisons, right? You need prisoners to keep your job. It's like you almost don't want to be too effective. That's a little bit more tinfoily, but, like, obviously there's an incentive for giant defense programs or intelligence institutions to create a motive to continue their job, right? So they're always, that's why the Defense Department is always pushing, like, oh, we need to make sure that we're anti-terrorism. Well, they're also getting a fat check for doing that too.
Well, yeah, you have to justify your budget somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, fun stuff. And on to Michael Flynn, I think it all really does tie back to it, because I think you had a really good point earlier when it almost seems like, unfortunately, because of some of the carelessness of this FISA process, and I would say some carelessness by James Comey and parts of the FBI.
Yes.
You had the struck page emails, all this stuff that, even though I don't think there was fire, it smelled like smoke. Maybe someone was using a smoky air conditioner or air freshener or something, but it kind of smelled like smoke. And that's the problem, is it kind of now puts a lot of questions in this whole investigation. And, I think there's two levels to Michael Flynn, is that I think that he was potentially punished too hard, but then at the same time, I also don't think it was a biased investigation to tarnish his career, because let's be honest, this was a man who, I will applaud him. He was a decorated general with a long service with a long career of service. And the problem is that Obama put sanctions on Russia back in, I think, 2015.
Uh-huh.
And Flynn goes over and says, don't worry, as soon as Trump is in office, these sanctions will be lifted. And then at the same time, he's working in Turkey helping nationals as a foreign agent. Right. And let's just be honest, naturally, the Obama administration aside, the FBI and the Justice Department and the independent watchdogs are going to want to look into it. And the problem is that they weren't even saying that what Flynn was doing was technically illegal at the time. The problem is that when he was asked about it and recordings of his own voice were played and they gave him a chance to be honest, he lied to the FBI.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just hate that people are saying, oh, they trapped him, it was entrapment. And no, because the FBI, it's reported, actually gave him a chance to come clean about it.
Right. Well, see, and yeah, there's a great New York Times article that you and I both have read that lays out all the different, like, arguments for and against the dropping of this, or the attempt to drop, because, again, Barr can't just drop it on himself. He made a recommendation to drop it. Only the judge on the case can drop it. But the attempt to drop this case is explained from all sides. And yeah, so that's the thing, is, like, this guy lied to the FBI about his actions. There's no two ways around it. He lied. Now his argument now is, well, I lied because at the time that's what my lawyers recommended would be the best thing. I didn't actually lie to say that I lied. I pleaded guilty to lying because I thought it was the best way to get the lowest sentence, right? All that stuff about, but he pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. That is a fact. One of the reasons that it's in debate is because, Barr is making the argument that the case at the time that they were getting these recordings of Flynn was, like, on its way out the door. Like, it had been decided that the case regarding Flynn individually was not enough to go criminal, and it was on its way to being closed. But during that bureaucratic closing process, then this new information about his lying came to light. Right. So there's this debate over, well, if the investigation was supposed to be closed at that point, then you can't use that evidence. But then there's a lot of legal experts that are saying no, that it would still be more broadly under the Crossfire Hurricane, which is the overarching counterintelligence investigation into Russia. So that it would still be considered within that investigation. Therefore, it's good evidence. So there's a lot of argument over the legitimacy, like the admissibility in court, right? And that's definitely there's definitely interesting arguments on both sides. But what's interesting to me is like that it's this case that's being so intensely looked at, that there's countless of cases where the FBI does stuff like this under overarching investigations, and then they go right through the courts. Boom, boom, boom. Let's go. Like, you don't no special treatment. You pleaded guilty. You pleaded guilty in a federal investigation. Guess what? You're going to get prosecuted. So I think that even though that there's some interesting irregularities in this case, definitely that we have to look at, I think most legal experts still agree that no, this is some real evidence and he pleaded guilty to do it. So, I mean, you got to go forward. And two, that it's just strange that it's this case that Barr is taking so much personal stock in it to make such a highly unusual decision to make a recommendation like this. And again, the New York Times explains that for an attorney general to recommend dropping a case where someone has pleaded guilty already, I mean, that's pretty unheard of. So it just strikes me as just so, not coincidental that Barr is sticking his neck out for Flynn, who Trump has constantly said is a good guy and needs to be dropped.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's a weird case, and you're right. For every, I don't know, I don't have the numbers, but for every 200 cases that could have irregularities, why are we focusing on this? And I mean, from the little bit of reading I've done just about a lot of these forms of cases, unfortunately the Justice Department in all levels of courts, from your local court all the way up to these appellate courts and whatnot, unfortunately, a lot of prosecutors and defense attorneys push for the client to plead guilty, because it's easier and it's cheaper, and I mean, Michael Flynn, I think it's reported he lost millions and millions of dollars in this, but it's usually easier to plead guilty than to go through the process. And I mean, talking about reform, I mean, I think there is an open discussion to say, should this man have almost been, I don't want to say he was forced into pleading guilty, but both sides usually kind of convince you that it's easier to plead guilty in a process, maybe even when there's more to be talked about in the situation. And so I think that there's a discussion that we do need to look at some ways to reform this entire process. But that being said, I think the elephant in the room is that this pandemic is not going well for Trump. Obama has spoken out against Trump's handling of this, and Trump's political career has started and ended with Barack Obama. And I think that Trump wants to paint this case specifically as foul play by the Obama administration before him. And he wants to make this kind of a political saving grace because, it kind of goes back, I won't touch on it much, but it goes back into this new, conspiracy inception of Obamagate that Trump's been touting recently. And it's just the fact that Trump from day one has blamed the Obama administration for spying on him and other members of his cabinet. And we're just going full circle back to that. And I think Trump and Barr and a lot of people inside the administration understand that this is a gray area case with a lot of difficult nuance to it, and it's one they can take advantage of. I mean, the Atlantic had an interesting article about why this case in specific, and then this whole Obamagate chaos that's kind of followed, which is basically him accusing the Obama administration of spying on Trump's allies. And I think the whole thing is that Obama in some ways kind of created Trump. And so Trump's wanted to kind of push back and almost erase everything Obama has done. I mean, at that White House Correspondents' Dinner when Obama made the joke that Trump needs to go back to moon landing conspiracies and Roswell, you saw Trump just fuming. And since then, he's wanted to pretty much just tarnish Obama's name And it just seems to me to be another one of that the Justice Department's just politicized this before election. Sorry, long rant short, but I think it's just a political play to distract.
I mean, it's always political with Trump. I mean, Trump is always concerned about his image and making sure he looks good constantly. I mean, we know that. There's no dispute. If anyone wants to dispute me on that, let's go toe to toe, because it's pretty obvious that Trump cares about his image and his optics almost more than anything else. And I think this also with Flynn, like, yes, like one, he can relate it back to Obama. He constantly wants to, trash Obama and relate it back. And then now that Obama has, I think it was leaked. I don't think it was official, but it was leaked, his criticism of Trump's handling. Because for a while, Obama's been pretty silent about criticizing his predecessor, and he's made a point about that. And because many presidents do, it's almost a classy thing to be like, Bush doesn't criticize Obama. Obama didn't criticize Bush during their in office, at least. So like Obama's been pretty silent about Trump, at least naming him by name. And so then this call comes out that he was, saying that it's a big mess and all this stuff. So, Trump's pissed, and he has this opportunity where Obama's in the news again. So he goes for the jugular. He's always going to be doing that. I also think that if he can get Flynn off, it can kind of more vindicate him with the whole Russia thing. Like, they didn't even get Flynn. I got out. Flynn got out. We're all good. We win, right? So he's trying to get that victory. But I also think he knows that it's a lot harder to get that optics victory if you pardon Flynn, right? Because a lot of people are asking, is he going to pardon Roger Stone? Is he going to pardon Michael Flynn? And I think this is an attempt to basically have the result you want. Flynn's out. You feel vindicated by your campaign. It's a big middle finger to Obama, right? Or what you think is a middle finger to Obama and his FBI. Then you can also avoid the public criticism if it's, hey, it wasn't me, it was the DOJ. I didn't pardon him. He just got out, fair and square, right? So I think this might have been a way to, for. Because I think Barr and Trump are a little too close. You're supposed to be independent of each other as the Department of Justice and the executive branch, but I think they're a little too close. And I think this is an example of them being too close, where it's Trump probably saying, help my boy out, right? He said that publicly multiple times. He said it publicly. Michael Flynn's a good guy. He's been badly abused. He should be released. He's just not saying it to anyone in particular, but he said it. So I think it's a way for him to get his buddy out without pardoning him and getting all the blame for that, because it's also being brought up in the discussion about Flynn too, because there's the talking point of, didn't Obama pardon a general for lying to the FBI? Yeah, he did. And I don't agree with it. Shortly before leaving office in 2017, Obama pardoned James E. Cartwright, a Marine Corps general who was guilty of lying to the FBI about his discussions of Iran's nuclear program. So, if we want to play that game of what about Obama? I don't like that either. I don't think presidents should have the ability to pardon, and two, definitely not if they're lying to the FBI. And so I think this is a way that Trump can do what Obama did without actually pardoning. So it's just as skeezy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, that'd be an interesting episode talking about pardoning at some point. But I think it is an outdated apparatus that now is just over politicized, right? And
right.
In some ways, this could be genius if it works out for Trump, just mainly because Obama is super popular on the left, but I think less than 10% of Republicans find Obama likable. And so clearly Trump's appealing to his base, and it just might work. But what you touched on too with the Justice Department being so close to Trump, to me it's a worrying trend, because this happened last night was the State Department's Inspector General Steve Linick was fired, and this is after the Horowitz guy we were talking about earlier, who put out that report on the FISA, who is the Inspector General. He was fired, and so Trump kind of one by one has been firing Inspector Generals, and through history this does happen, but to me it's eroding a bit of government accountability. that we're seeing more and more, and it's allowing these things to happen without any oversight. And these inspector generals in each part of the government are quite crucial to at least ensure that there is a feeling of accountability, and
Right.
it's that to me is a little bit alarming, but it's just the following trend. Like, there's really nothing crazy to report here based on the last 3.5 years.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like, I think that would be my ending point of this episode is there are things happening right now that look like there's government accountability, right? The Justice Department looking into an overbearing FBI investigation, and then the Senate passing these, we need a third party accountability on FISA courts. That all looks good, but then you look deeper and it turns out, in my opinion, that the Justice Department is not counting government accountability and in fact getting rid of it. And then also the Senate, part of that little bill that they snuck through was repealing any protections against, warrants for search history. So it's like, it's like this weird time where it's like you could definitely see it as there's more government accountability, but I think the deeper you look, you find that there's less. It's almost like an iceberg that just has the top.
Yes, I would agree. I think that's a good point. Accountability is definitely not at an all-time high.
No, not at all.
Well, Drew, I don't unless you have anything else to say. I think that does it for me, at least.
Yeah. Same here.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough talk. I'm sure something we'll touch on numerous occasions. But thanks everyone for listening. What do you guys think? Let us know. We're always curious to hear. And as always, we're on YouTube, Podbean, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and all those third-party sites that I keep forgetting the name for. So have a great day, and thanks for listening.
I wonder if my FBI FISA agent is going to share my disdain for the final season of Game of Thrones based on my internet search history. Anyway, take care, guys. Thank you for listening.